1 in 5 children on this planet are obese. Today we're going to talk about how we fix that. Or, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about childhood obesity. Children ages 5 through 9, the prevalence of their obesity has increased from 4% in 1975 to just over 18% in 2016. Today, we're going to talk about how we fix that. Okay, which one of those are you going to remember? 9 weeks from now, 9 days from now, 9 minutes from now. Great stories happen to those who can tell them, meaning that there is a skill set in crafting and telling a great story. Great storytellers, by definition, are great communicators. And if you want to be successful today in both life and business, you need to be a great communicator. So today, if you want to get a little bit better at storytelling, stay tuned. You can put 100 people in a room, you can tell them a story, you can give them one statistic. 10 days later, 63 of those people will remember that story. Only 5 will remember that statistic. Why is that? Stories engage both sides of our brain, the logical side and the emotional side. They actually increase our attention, our ability to comprehend something complex. They increase our empathy, and they actually decrease our defensiveness. All right, this episode is going to have content from 3 books. Storytelling with Data, The Power of Storytelling, and Stories That Stick. You will find the link to all 3 books in the resource box below. Okay, let's kick it off with 3 tips for great storytelling. Number 1, less is more. Keep it simple. Minimize the cognitive overload of your listener and of your audience. Tip number 2, have a process. Great stories don't just get told. We don't just tell them. You have to put some work into it, some practice into it. So you need process, and I'll share my process with you. Tip number 3, always connect your facts and ideas with emotions. A great fact will get your attention. An emotional tug will make you remember it. You combine the two, you inspire someone to act. Okay, there are many different types of stories. We're going to really focus in on 2 today. The customer data story and the personal inspiration story. Regardless of what story you're telling, everybody should have the same goal: to inspire someone to do something differently, to change, to take a different point of view, to hear a different perspective. Okay, for the customer data story, data storytelling requires or involves the skillful combination of 3 things: data, narrative, and visuals. Here's how those 3 fit together. If you combine your data with your narrative, you explain to the audience what's going on. You explain to them what's happening with the data. When visuals are combined with data, you enlighten the audience. You give them the opportunity to see something that they might not have seen with just the data. Finally, when you combine all 3, the narrative, the visuals, and the data, you engage your audience. You entertain your audience. You make them pay attention. Now, the easy one and my favorite is the inspirational personal story. This is a story where you want to tug on the spirit strings or the heartstrings of your listener. Okay, let's talk about the 3 components of a great story. Number 1, identifiable characters. A relatable hero, a villain, someone that your audience can relate to. They need to be able to step in the shoes of that character and learn a lesson based on the actions of that character. If we can make them relate to our characters, then they will remember our story. The second component of a great story is a trackable structure. You have to be able to follow the story. There's a ton of different ways you can do this, but I prefer Kendra Hall's process. You have a normal with a hook, then you have an explosion, and then you have a new normal. Right? So you want to define those 3 components. The normal would be what's happening, your bar for the story. The hook would be that tug on an emotion. Stronger the emotion, stronger the story. Fear, sacrifice, struggle are all good. But you've got to find a way to hook that person in the first 30 seconds so they continue listening and paying attention to your story. Then you have an explosion. The explosion is what I like to call a walk into church naked moment. It's got to be that big. It's got to be a recognizable explosion. And then after that explosion, you're going to have a new normal, right? You're doing things differently. In a personal story that's inspirational, that may be a life lesson learned. In a business story, it may be next steps or a solution. The third component of a great story is stains. Stain the brain. What do you want to etch in the brain of the listener so they're going to remember your story, right? We forget names and dates. We do remember smells, feelings, and visuals. An example would be, hey, I did a race last summer. It was really hot. It was about 120 degrees on average all race, and only 923 people have ever finished that race. Or, last summer I did a race in the desert. It was so friggin' hot that the asphalt melted the soles off of my shoes. More people have summited Mount Everest than have ever finished that race. All right, moving on. Now we're going to talk about 3 common mistakes or worst practices that people make when it comes to storytelling. Number 1, assuming that the facts speak for themselves. They don't. If so, we all react differently to facts. If we agree with the person, we normally believe the fact. If we don't, we don't. An example would be in the morning, you walk into the bathroom, step on the scale, you look down. If that number is less than the number in your head, you're going to believe that fact. If it's not, what do? We step off the scale, let it reset, step back on. 99% of the time, that number is the same. And when it is, what do? We disagree. We tell ourselves a story. Scale must be off. Second common mistake or worst practice when it comes to storytelling, people don't know their audience, right? This is pretty straightforward. You have to know your audience. You have to know what's going to turn them on, what's going to turn them off, right? If I'm telling a story in Europe and I'm talking about temperature and I'm talking about distance and I talk about miles and Fahrenheit, I lost them. They're going to say, hey, how many degrees Celsius is that? How many kilometers is that? Okay, the third mistake and worst practice when it comes to storytelling, specifically business storytelling, is busy visual anchors. If you have to open a slide by saying, now I know this is a little complex and busy and you probably can't see all the numbers, but if you direct your attention to the second row down and the third column over, leave it out. You already lost them, right? It's too much. Anybody recognize this slide? It's one of mine. That is what you call a vampire slide. If you have a 30-minute presentation with 25 slides and 2 of them are vampire slides, and by vampire slide I mean it sucks the enthusiasm out of your audience, they're not going to remember it. Imagine an executive that has 3 meetings back to back in the rest of their day. You think they're going to remember that slide? Think again. Okay, let's bring it home and talk about the process of storytelling. Find, define, craft, and tell. Okay, the first step is find, right? Find your why. Why are you telling this story? What is the purpose, right? And how are you going to tell it? Okay, the second part of the process is define, right? We talked about those key components of a great story earlier. You're going to define those, right? You want to define your characters, define your hook, define your explosion, right? Define your stains. What are you going to stain their brain with? Okay, the third part of the process is craft your story. Write it down. Write down an outline. We talked about earlier, you have your normal or your baseline with a hook. You've got your explosion, your walk into church naked moment, and then you've got your new normal, right? I have found that if I outline my story in those buckets, it's easy for me to tell the story and I'm less likely to leave out any good information. The fourth and final part of the process, also the most fun part, tell your story. Vary your intensity, change your tone, be authentic, embellish. Get into your story. The more you get into it, the more they're going to get into it. That's a wrap. Think back 9 minutes ago. If I were to ask you, what do you remember about the 2 quick stories I told you on childhood obesity? Would you remember that kids age 5 to 19, the prevalence of obesity has grown in that group from 4% in 1975 to just over 18% in 2016? Or would you remember me stuffing my face with a Twinkie telling you that 1 in 5 children are obese? If that's what you remember, then I stained your brain and you are going to be a little bit better at storytelling.